Dan, here we are in sunny California, Pasadena, and what a better place on a sunny day to talk about trains. We're at the coach yard.
That's right.
All right. And so today we thought we'd just take something that we haven't really addressed before, and that is weathering of brass model trains. You know, in the past, I know we've gotten some across our site, and we at one time had the thought that, well, weathering might devalue a model, but I think we've seen with proper or excellent weathering that it actually increases the value of a model.
Yeah, I used to tell people when they would call that if a model was weathered, what it would do is it would reduce the amount of people that would want that model.
Right.
Because many collectors wanted, at least in my opinion, in our opinion, a pristine model, like as it came from the factory. And it is true that not everybody wants a weathered model, but it's something that when it's much like a paint job, like we tell people, well, does paint increase or decrease? It kind of depends on the quality of paint. If, in some cases, a custom paint job can be better than a factory paint job. And that's certainly true with weathering. If it's a top quality weathering job, it is creating something that is so realistic when you put it on a proper layout or in a setting and take a photograph. It's hard to even tell if you're looking at the prototype or a model.
Yeah. And, you know, based upon what we have here on the table, I can say in looking at these, and these are incredible weathering jobs. Each one of them has their own character. There's no two that are the same. And when they're done so well like they are here by some of our masters, we really appreciate it.
And I want to add to that because we had a customer once who was a professional, well-known artist. And he would only buy a well-weathered model because in his mind, that was true art. It looked so much like the real thing that's what he loved. And I think that was kind of a nice way to sum up how many feel about these. But you mentioned it's hard to get information about really what goes into it because it's much more than just airbrushing it or there's so much that goes into that. So how would we find out more about it?
I don't know. You know, we've had Boyd on the show, we've had Hal on the show, but they don't necessarily weather.
That's not their main forte.
Yeah, so why don't we just talk to a couple of guys who really can weather. In fact, who have performed this beauties right here in front of us on the table. And why don't we make it a series?
All right.
We'll go through and we'll see about how to weather brass model train. Look who we have with us.
Hey, guys.
All right, so we have Jerry Spolema and Juan Zuloaga.
Good to see you again.
Nice to have you with us.
Thank you for having us.
Now, Juan, I know that you've learned a lot from Jerry. So we're going to have to call Jerry the master, you're the grasshopper. Is that okay?
That's perfect. It pretty much describes us.
Yeah. So how's it been learning from Jerry?
Outstanding. I mean, when I first met Jerry, I had my own ideas of weathering, and airbrushing was very common for me at that time. And when I saw his weathering jobs, I was just awestruck because I was like, wow, I want to do that. That was a new standard set completely. And it was not necessarily, not only did it give the model character, but it was truly a work of art. And as I got to know Jerry, and he was definitely an art major and knew what he was doing. And so it wasn't something that he just came up and I watched for many hours and practiced a lot. And I could still say, even though I've been doing this for over about 25 to 30 years now, I'm still not up to the
master.
To the master. He's definitely A1 on that.
Are you blushing, Jerry? Just a little bit?
Never been called a master before.
Yeah, right. Having this guy around, how was it?
Well, he was a pain. Well, never mind.
There you go.
He was okay. He understood what I was doing from the beginning, and so that having that knowledge, he just got into it, and it's a process. What you do today, you may not like next month because you're continually improving your technique, and he does that. He's even taught me a few things. And taught me a few things I didn't want. It's weathering's an individual deal anyway, and I weather these models because I've seen the steam locomotive in service. I have a large collection of photographs. I just like the steam locomotive, and to me, this is representing what I've come to like.
Sure.
And it's been work. It's been fun.
Yeah. And how long have you been weathering now?
Bob DeWitt, a friend of mine, got me started early 60s.
Okay.
Something like that. And it's interesting, when I started, there was not that many models out there and not that many books. But as books and research came available, brass became even more available, and my likes and dislikes got larger. But also, I saw more pictures that indicated that even weathering has a locale or a certain area. Southwest has its own characteristics. Northern areas have a different characteristic, which I found all of that interesting. Then in later years, color books came out, and that was a real...
that's a game changer.
I had to get rid of a lot of black and white books. But no, I just enjoy the steam locomotive, and I enjoy trying to make it the way I remember it. Yeah.
Now, we were talking earlier, and you were telling me about there are many different types of techniques that are out there as far as weathering is concerned, and yours is going to be different than what perhaps someone else is going to do.
There are so many different... There's no one correct way of doing it. There are so many different techniques. I like going to train shows to learn what other people are doing and see if I can adopt anything from that to what I do. And it's been a great help. The narrow gauge convention has been good. There's a lot of modelers. Jim Booth has been quite helpful. He's had clinics, and it's interesting. I always learn something at those.
Very nice. So throughout this series, and we certainly want to thank you both ahead of time for sharing with us some of your expertise in this weathering technique. And in these series that are about to come in these next few weeks, we're going to see this particular model, the K36 right here, that you've done from beginning to end, and the weathering process. And in viewing some of this, I have a great appreciation now for what's involved and how many different steps there are in weathering.
Well, people ask me all the time, how do I do it or whatever? And occasionally, if I know them, I start describing what I do. And not too long after I start, their eyes begin to glass over and they kind of turn away and leave. But for those who do this, it means more than somebody who's never done it. Yeah. And from that standpoint, and he's been my best pupil.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and the truth is, you just gotta. A lot of people are afraid to take their models apart and weather the model, and just that's why we like brass models, because it's really easy to strip it, start all over again, clean it up, get it back to brand new. Unlike on a plastic model, you can't do that. You can on a brass model. So that has been one of the best parts of brass. And when I first started out, and you tend to overdo it, and it just quite doesn't run. And then as you learn to work with your brushes and get the strokes right, and things start to how do you work things and what the actual engine does, you actually refine yourself and you get much better at it. But the key is one of the things that he says is, I was willing to try and work it out. That a lot of people think that, I just want to be done in one day. This is not the type of paint job that you're not going to do in one day. This is it doesn't matter whether we go a light or whether we do heavy weathering. It's the same process all along, and it's basically completely disassembling the model and going through it little by little, and just when we do it light, it's not as many washes, but it still requires the same amount of brush strokes and the same amount of time to get through it.
Yeah, and Juan, I think you helped eliminate the first misconception many may have about weathering. One, that it's easier than painting, right. And two, that you don't have to take your model apart, because an amateur trying to weather may just think he can, not have to do that. But there's a great amount of work, and we're going to see that, as you mentioned, Roland, throughout this series, really get an appreciation for what goes into it.
Absolutely.
Now, tell us a little bit about the tools that you're going to use here, and some of the chemicals actually that we're going to see.
Well, let's start with brushes. I like the flat, I call them chisel brushes.
Okay.
For surfaces such as the side of a tender, flat surface,
right.
The cab, broad areas, and they come in many different sizes. So you can bring them down for closer work. For things like streaking, you want a good pointed brush that holds a point when it's wet. You use that to streak. I use it on smoke boxes particularly when I want to streak the paint. And you're controlling. Basically, you're drawing paint, remove it from certain areas, streaking with the brush both up and down. You'll see in the video later on. And I find a good brush in this particular instance is very desirable. I get them mostly from art stores.
Okay.
And then I have a collection of brushes that look terrible. This is kind of a scrub brush that I use to basically put it on. These are for specific areas where a stiff brush is useful, like say on a tender truck where I have surfaces that are out and in. This can hit the outer area without touching what's inside, and it has become very useful. Also, afraid somebody thinks it's a worthless brush and use it for something else and it's gone.
Yeah. And no one would do that, would they?
Well, around my store, I worry about that.
Yeah.
And the paints I'm using, most of my years that I've been weathering, I weathered with Floquil.
Right.
And a lot of the early engines were painted with lacquers, auto lacquers, mainly because not only it was fast drying, but it had a good gloss. But the Floquil weathering over it, the thinners used for Floquil did not disturb the lacquer that was under it. And this weathering technique that I use is a series of layers, and each time I clear coat, forming a barrier between what was down previously and what is being added. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do the washes I do without lifting the older paint up. And since Floquil left, I had to find an alternative, and I went to oil paints.
Mm-hmm. Which we have here on the table, right?
I have been experimenting with some artist oils, but I've been using You
want me to say the name?
Yes.
Abteilung. Abteilung. That's it. Does that sound good enough?
Better than my tongue can do. I believe it's made in Spain, and they describe it as a weathering oils, and I get it from a local hobby shop from MIG Products, I believe.
Okay.
And they have a wide range of colors, and I have a chart.
Yeah, we see our chart here.
And I hope to whittle that down to maybe about half, but at the moment I'm experimenting with different combinations of colors.
Right. Because dirt and rust come in a lot of different colors.
They come in all, and again, depending where you are, as far as where you're modeling, what part of the country. Now, the thinners that the art stores have, for the most part, are way too slow drying. Now, for instance, I'll spray a dirty wash over the tender to work it, and I use Scale Coat 1 thinner, because it will dry to the point where I can pick it up. Right. If it wasn't for that, this whole model would be wet. And so
we absolutely have to have a fast drying thinner.
There are some other possibilities I have not tried. Enamel reducers. Does Tesla still make their airbrush
cleaner?
Yeah.
That's a possibility. And Abteilung has a thinner that I haven't tried, mainly because the shop only had a small bottle, and I'd go through that in 10 seconds. But so it's still an experiment.
It's always evolving, right? As to the things that you could possibly use.
In California specifically, that we've had a big change as far as what paints are available, such as the lacquer paints or solvent-based paints. They're trying to eliminate them, and they're taking us into acrylics. The only thing we still have are the oil-based paints that are produced at the art stores, and and we also have the Model Masters paints, which I have painted with the Model Masters or weathered with the Model Masters paint. The advantage is, and the key to the process in our weathering is, once you paint the engine, we need to be able to apply a wash and remove this wash or work this wash without attacking the paint underneath.
Right.
So we have to find a thinner that will thin this paint allow us to make our movements without destroying the previous paint the main base paint that's on there. So it's kind of we've been using automotive lacquers for many years, but obviously that's becoming obsolete at the moment, and we're redefining or trying to find new applications for it, with, like, for example, using Tester's lacquer and using these oils. The problem is Tester's lacquer doesn't hold up to the scale coat. So if we could find some of the ones that you had mentioned earlier, but some kind of a reducer that would allow us to thin these paints and work it without attacking that other, to give us a barrier, what they refer to as a barrier, we'll be able to continue make working with less harsher paints.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think it's time. We've laid all of this out. Let's go ahead and what we're going to tell our audience is that they're going to see across their screen at times a full screen of you going ahead and taking care of this K36. We're going to start off with the tender, I believe it is. We're going to see it here on a TV, and we're going to talk about some of these processes and the techniques and the terms that are used in weathering a model. We see off to the left, that's your paint palette, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Also, you'll notice that the model is sitting on a pad. It's an artist's sketch pad.
Okay.
It's soft. It gives it a nice base to be working on, because you're going to be turning it around. And when it gets dirty, you just rip a piece off and use the next one.
Okay. So what are some of your first steps here?
It looks like I've got white on there right now. And people keep asking me what I use. And I say, well, dab of this and that, because basically you'll see that's what I'm doing.
Right.
I'm mixing the white with the yellow and a little ochre. I'm trying to get kind of what the old days with Floquo mud used to look like. And then mix it, and then add a little black and get a kind of a warm gray. A friend of mine, Jim Fennell of Durango Press, wants to describe it as warm weathering. I don't just use white and black. Mm-hmm. I use all kinds of warm colors, which is what Mother Nature uses.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to basically spray the entire tender with this dirty wash. And it's a very thin wash.
Now, has anything happened prior to this spot right here with the tender? Do you put any type of a clear coat or anything?
This engine has been painted. I think I used primed by Auto Lacquer. Mm-hmm. Painted with, I think, Star Brands from PBL.
Okay.
Clear coat it with, again, a clear lacquer. Decaled and then re-cleared again. And then off we go.
Okay. So here we go. All right.
By the way, if you mix your paint the way I did by blocking the front of the airbrush, make sure you only use a little bit of
just a little bit
air. Otherwise, you've got a face full of paint.
You better have glasses on. So what are you doing here? You just hitting spots?
I'm just applying it all over. I've seen a lot of models where this is it.
Yeah. Most people do that.
Yeah,
that's it. They're done.
Weathering, right?
That's their weathering. Yeah.
It's been described to me as putting it on and taking it off, which is pretty much a pretty good description of what I'm doing.
Okay.
And the paint will settle in certain areas and crevices. It'll be moved around. What I'm doing now is mixing some colors, some browns, and we'll probably be hitting either the field bunker or the tender deck will be more of a warm color.
Okay.
But it doesn't make much difference at this stage because most of it's going to be removed in the process.
Right.
And but each time you do it, even though it's light, it
so we
continues
see the liquid
to build up.
And we see that liquid falling down in there too, right? Yeah.
Like I said, it gets wet.
Yeah.
And that's where your barrier is important.
And what brush is this? Which one is this?
This is my little scrub brush.
The scrub brush, you call it.
Doozy.
There you go.
Doesn't look like
that one's
much.
been around for a while.
This time I got to find another one because it's getting pretty small.
That's cool. All right, so you're just scrubbing it all over, right?
This doesn't take any real skill at the moment. It's just I'm just putting it around. And I'm doing this as much as just to see how it's going because most of it's going to be under coal when I get through.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of people right there, they would say, okay, I'm done weathering. That's what they call a weathering. And that's where I would say, no, you're not.
Not even close, is
no. But we see a lot of models go through there, you know, and it's like they're hideous.
Right. Now, are you looking for the paint to accumulate in the crevices there?
Yes. You're going to want to eventually accumulate in everywhere, but the upper decks tend to get a real mess from the water overflow when they overflow the tender. And when I start moving it, I make sure I don't want to leave any brush strokes visible, which is quite possible. And it, see, I'm getting down in the back crevices, and I'll try to get it down around the base of the water hatch.
I notice here that the doghouse is not on that tender, but we see it on the model here on our table.
Yeah, I took it off when I painted it because I wanted to get inside. I also had to redesign the mount. I don't remember how it was attached originally, but I had to drill and tap a hole.
Okay.
And when I did do that and put it on, I thought, well, it's on, I'll leave it. The basic floor weathering was done, and I could work around it after that.
Okay. All right. So it still's got a little bit of wetness, it looks to it still.
Yeah, it'll take a little while.
Yeah.
It's interesting in this video, if the light hits it just right, it looks like I'm putting a blue wash on the thing. This is, the cold doors get pretty well beat up and rusty, and I try to keep some warm colors.
Now, you mentioned before trains in different locations would look a little differently. Is this because of the different colors associated with rock beds and things like that?
I noticed, for instance, when I was up in Proctor, Minnesota, on the route from the DM and IR, it's an iron ore country, and the ground had an iron ore look, a reddish look, which could be a effect. If you go through southwestern part of the United States, you'll see that the Southern Pacific, UP, and Santa Fe had a lot of white compound forming. It was common in hot desert areas. Some of that same color is universal, but not as much. And if you're modeling a model that, say, is in the age of steam, if you will, where it was still maintained, a lot of the heavy weathering off a run would be washed off. Later on, it just kept accumulating. They used less and less time to maintain it. And particularly some of the locomotives on the UP and the Southern Pacific really got white.
So now you switch brushes.
This is my flat brush.
Okay.
And I do a lot of the work with that. But I'm beginning to move the paint away or where I want it.
Now, is this considered the wash part that you're calling the wash part? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what he's doing is he's adding color, specific colors to certain areas, such as the inside, which is going to be a little more rusty, which obviously, so he's adding some warmer colors to represent more of a rust look. Like we're in the back or the top of the tender tank, obviously, you're going to get a lot of water and accumulation of water just sitting there will and with the sun beating it out on it, the elements are on it, you're going to get some rust. Also around the front of the coal boards, you're going to have a lot of rusting area. And these are all metal parts. I mean, these are parts that just naturally. So what he's basically done is he's given you some color already, and he's starting to apply a difference between that and the sides. You know, even though some of it will get into the sides, but it's not necessarily. He hasn't even tried to apply it. He's applied it, like for example, on the back, where you have the hinges or where the brackets to the tender are, which are bolted down, which obviously tend to rust out with. So that's kind of where he's at right now, and you can see he's streaking, and obviously by not necessarily streaking, that's not that he's moving the paint around and allowing a residue to remain, a certain residue to remain in certain cracks and crevices.
Okay. Now, I noticed that the technique of the stroke is in the same direction. You're going up now on the inside of that right there.
Right. And you can see every time he strokes his brush, what he's trying to do is he's trying to clean his brush or the paint off of his brush. He's removing paint instead of applying paint.
Right. Okay.
Like right now, he'll clean his brush and then kind of, remove all the old paint and then.
Oh, okay.
And then,
because you're literally just moving that paint that's on there right now, the oil-based paint, right? You're just moving that around, thinning it out.
Mm-hmm. Well, streaking it, like right here, he's streaking it, so it looks like it's, especially on the back of the tender, where it's going to be swaying back and forth, and
right.
So you're getting streaks.
I don't necessarily want it to look like I painted it on.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't want to necessarily see the brush strokes. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So it's not necessarily uniform in the sense it's you want to look like it actually happened while the engine's in service.
Okay.
And that's kind of what you have to be thinking about. What's going to happen when water is up here, what actually will happen to the paint. And we all kind of have a rough idea of what it looks like. It's just a matter of how do we acquire this technique, or what do we do to make it look that way. Some people use dry brushing techniques. This is similar, except it's the reverse. We've applied the paint, now we're taking it off, but it's all wet and allowing streaks to just leave a small remnants of it. But
the advantage here versus a dry brushing is you can really get it in the nooks and crannies.
That's exactly what I was going to say, which is what you were seeing right there. You're building up the nooks and crannies.
Okay.
And it's not, as you're going to see several of this. This is not just one application. It requires several applications, because every time you clear it, it will somewhat make it go away. It will kind of, when you apply a clear to it, it does kind of disguise it. So you got to build it up again until the color really starts showing up.
Okay. So now we have the
same thing
underside there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you even paint the inside of it.
I think he was showing off there.
I'm impressed now. Weathering coming in there now.
I think we were, I believe, he goes.
He'll weather anything.
Yeah, he's even pointing at it, so there's something.
Just something there. Just in case that water hatch opens and you can see down in there.
But the truth is, you know what, when you have the tender off, you gotta cover it, because not all tenders go all the way to the edge. Sometimes the tender is narrower, and you really have to take care of the top of the tender also, especially on the rear part of the tender.
Okay. All right. And I want to ask a question about your palette over there. So now, how many steps, first of all, how many times are you going to wash this thing?
This is the first step. So
maybe, I think I did 3. There was maybe a 4th time, but each time I'm getting closer in and not doing a broad thing. So the 4th time I was maybe hitting just the sides, maybe a little work on the rear frog, and the same with the tender. I'm trying to get it look like dust had been thrown up along the side of the engine. And you'll notice that the tender will not be one color from top to bottom. It actually got several variations to it.
Now, here's a good point to right now apply why we use fast drying paint or fast drying thinner. As you'll see, he's applying, and you'll see the wet areas, but you'll see that immediately it begins to dry or evaporate. And we can go immediately back into it and start working on it again.
And you see why I use a big, broad flat brush, too.
So now, do you how long does it take for this to dry? I mean, how long do you wait?
Usually when I'm doing this, I got more than one model I'm working on, and I'll set it aside. I have a toaster oven that I will set it on top with the door cracked, and it'll have a warm airflow over it, which will help it dry, but it'll be pretty much dry to the touch, 5-10 minutes, maybe 15, sometime like that. But as far as going back over it, clear coating, going back over it, it'll probably be the next day, or if it's early enough in the day, late at night. But normally I like to let it set overnight. Right. And if I can, I like to let the clear coat set overnight, even though it's also
so do you put an extra amount here, like I see it on the re-railers there and stuff, and on the side of it?
Yeah, I'm picking up, that's a channel, and I'm picking up the corners and accent. You're basically drawing out the detail if you can. And there's a number of items attached to the side, the re-rail frogs and so forth.
Because normally that the water and everything else would accumulate in there and sit in there anyways. Right?
Well, the dust is kicking into those into those rails, and it's going to stay in the cracks of the rails. And even when they wash the engine, they're going to wash it, and they don't really go into the cracks to try and clean those cracks, so they kind of remain there.
Okay. So now your palette there, you keep that same palette throughout this whole process, right?
Yes.
All 3 washes and everything, you just keep using the same palette.
It gets kind of grungy, but yes, I do.
See that. I'm sure it's going to get worse too.
Well, the paint, those droplets of paint will stay soft enough to use for several days. And sometimes I'll just pour a little thinner over it to soften it up. But eventually it gets too hard and might just well throw it away and start over. I probably should use, I need to get some, a white background, which will show the blend a little easier than working on that tan.
Oh,
it's
because of it being cardboard
brown. Just a piece of cardboard.
Okay.
Sometimes I will put a splash of paint on my sketch pad that's white just to see what I've got.
So as we can see, this is quite the process, huh? And we're only in the first step, right?
Yeah, and it's really tedious. It takes, doing a tender can take you a couple hours just to sit there and apply the paint, clean it, and, pretty much just doing the tender floor as he sees it right now. It's going to take him, he'll go through it pretty quickly, but it's about half an hour just to get through this process right here. And he's not done because you'll see he comes back to it over and over again. It's very tedious work. That's why sometimes when people want me to paint something for them, I'll say, do you want it weathered or unweathered? And when they say unweathered, I kind of smile because I know it's not going to be anything tedious. As a matter of fact, I have a good friend of mine that just asked me to weather his model. He goes, I want it light. And I said, oh. And so he tried to give me some ridiculous low price on, to weather, because I just want it light. And I go, it's the same price whether it's light. It goes, you still have to take it apart? I go, if you want my weathering, yes. If not, I'll be glad to send it to you unweathered.
So what are the varying degrees of weathering then? You mentioned light, you mentioned dirty.
Light, your passenger, for example, especially when you get into some of the Southern Pacific engines, which are very bright, and they were constantly washed. They tend to be very lightly weathered. I mean, they did get dirty and grungy, but you mostly want to try and keep them pretty light. Around the drivetrain area, you're going to see more dirt, but not as much buildup as we would on a freight engine. When we're working on more of a freight engine, then we're talking anywhere from medium, and medium basically being that the engine has been in service for a while, and heavy meaning the engine's kind of getting ready to needing to be rebuilt and go back into the paint booth, which they would constantly do. And they did get kind of grungy, and I've been somebody joked around with me saying, "Oh, you weathered this model like it's in the boneyard," And I said, no, it's ready for the boneyard, though, which some of them were operating till that point.
So do you find customers have a different understanding of what's light weathering and what's super dirty?
Most customers want the heavy weathering or medium weathering because they want to see the detail.
Yeah.
But they're a little leery because they're so used to getting models from other people that have been airbrushed or, that appear that they said, no, I want it light because they don't want anything that looks like it's been barfed on, when they see my models and they said, I want it like this. And I go, well, that would be considered heavy. And he goes, oh, I thought that was light.
Right. And that's what I was thinking. I mentioned that earlier today. Yeah. I thought this was like maybe a lighter.
No, that would be a heavy weather.
Heavy, but it's done so well. That's why, compared to some of the ones that we've
Correct. Seen. That's a perfect representation of a model of an engine that basically, as a matter of fact, it's an RGS engine. This was sold to the RGS. It was already kind of late in its life. It was, it already had a lot of problems, but the RGS continued to use it because it was a poor railroad in a sense, and it was falling apart. But the engine continued. They didn't service it very well, and it was dirty, grimy. There was no longer any sheen to the paint at all, and it was rusting in many areas, and that's basically your heavy weathering because it's still operational. It's not in the boneyard yet. The boneyard one is. I would recommend looking at a picture of the K-27 when they took it to Knott's Berry Farm. and it's sitting on a flat car. And that's boneyard weathering. When I've seen people model that or do their engines, I think that's a bit much.
Very nice.
So I also noticed, Jerry, that you're not afraid to get into the dark end of the spectrum with those colors with this, whereas like with the dry brushing, again, you would tend to stick to lighter colors. With this method, you can really get those kind of dark and grimy.
The it's all contrast, and the darker colors, you see some bright colors. The mixture of the two will subdue it, but the various variations I can get in color are quite a bit. And this paint, I'm still learning to use it, and eventually I will weed certain colors out that I don't use, but it's going to take a little while. And I try not to, you'll see on the frame when you get to it, that there's a lot of different colors involved. And basically, when you're done, it's you can highlight certain areas. Even on the frame, it's not just one color. You'll find certain areas, like on the boiler, heavier weathering, where the appliances are steam driven and there's a lot of water running down. It'll weather differently. The sides of the tender is a little more darker, but there's an area where dust is kicked up, and it gives the model some lightness and darkness that you can't get. Juan mentioned, by the way, early on that we start with a shiny black engine. I like to liken it to a black and white photograph. If you go with grimy black, you basically have limited yourself to the mid-tone ranges, whereas if you're using a black engine, it's like using the full scale from white to black, and it gives you the variations that I think make an engine come to life.
Got our palette looking kind of messy there. Tell us what's going on here.
Well, just the usual. I'm mixing this and that to get the color I'm looking for. It's the light color, using the yellows, ochre, a little bit of brown, and there should be a touch of black in there, right there.
Because we're working on the trucks here.
We're making a warm gray. Oh, we are working on trucks.
Right.
Yeah, the trailing truck.
Yep. Now, is there anything different about the trucks because the trailing truck versus the lead trucks? Sometimes
on a steam locomotive, they're hanging down low toward the rear of the engine is the exhaust from the injector, which is putting out a wet
is that the blowdown
steam, and there's also a blow off, which is a little further up on the frame on this particular engine, and a lot of times that will sometimes leave white residue. So usually the trailing truck is a lot lighter. And you can see my scrubby brush there. I'm hitting some high areas, trying to keep the lower areas with paint.
In other words, what he's doing is basically allowing the same thing, the residue and the dirt building up along some of the bottoms and some of the tops that's kind of been washed off, or not dust. Since these are really close to the ground, there's a lot of dust and dirt. You got the blow off from the especially on the steam engine, where they got the blow off and it just blows all over the place. So he's highlighting that area.
I treat the trucks as a separate model and render them so that they're not just this one color object under the frame. It also gets all the lights and darks that I use. Now, around the journals, there's oil, so usually it's a lighter or darker color. And locomotive or models that have a lot more detail.
Right. I can't believe how much effort goes into this. I mean, just to take those trucks apart like that, instead of doing it all at once, each of them is
keep in mind,
done.
I take it apart because eventually you're going to have to take it apart and clean the wheels and everything. You might as well do it now.
Right.
Especially if you're painting, you're going to find that the wheel treads are painted along with everything else.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say what we call a first wash kind of oversimplifies it. I mean, it makes it sound like, oh, we're doing a quick first wash and then the next step, but there's a lot in that step.
Right
so
now,
when you get done, it looks simplified because there's not much going on. It's just a base.
And tell us right here, because you've already done your first wash here. You've already done your coating on it, right? Your clear flat on there.
Let me see here.
Yeah, it looks like you're on your second wash.
Stage. The doghouse is on already.
Yeah.
Okay. There's it's not a dead flat. There's a slight eggshell look to it, which I think aids in the in, if you will, moving the paint around. Flatter it is. It's a little more difficult, but it also gives you a better idea of what is happening as far as color. At this stage, you'll begin to see the differences, particularly along the top decks, and then you take it to the next step, third step, and again you're picking out details as you go.
Right. And I see you're filling your cup here with the paints because you're about to spray this again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So it's pretty much a similar process that you had in the first one.
Yeah. This is kind of a dark, warm gray.
Okay.
Not dark, but medium. And I probably will do more of a spot location, not everything.
Not as much as before.
You can see I'm hitting the bottom, bringing it up.
Mm-hmm.
As we said, it's tedious work, so he's basically again. A lot of people would have assumed, oh, well, the tender looks done.
Yeah.
But no, it needs a little more to give it that character.
Right.
And what he's building on is the streaking. Mostly what he's working on more of the colors right now on the top deck to get more of the fading on the top deck as the sun beams down on it, and to differentiate from the sides, which would be a little darker. But on the sides, he's still working on building up on the streaks and the dirt that, let's say, would be brushed off, as the engine's rolling, that would be on the sides.
Okay. All right. So you had mentioned about some of the different, whether it's a full flat or semi-gloss eggshell. What are the differences that you look for in a finished model?
Well, you'll notice even on the heavily weathered, but and this one that if you look at the side, it's not one tone; it's different tones. And if you look at a photograph of a locomotive, certain areas tend to build up more weathering. Keep in mind these engines are outside; they get wet and get rinsed down, and it's a great way to highlight certain areas. The newer engine or the engines that have been shopped more recently will be more black, but not one area, even on the heavy weather, is just one tone, and it's not all flat. There, you'll see some areas that have a sheen to it or a little bit of a gloss to it. Other areas are dead flat. The clear coat I use, it's basically a clear lacquer. And I have two jars. One is clear, which is a gloss, and the other one is clear with a flattening compound in it. And I can mix it to where I can get a dead flat. And I can get anything in between by mixing and matching the two colors. And it gives you a lot of variation in the finish. I don't like seeing a model that's just one flat color.
All flat or all
dead
satin,
flat.
right. So now, do you then, for example, if you have something a little shiny here, so do you feather that in?
Yeah.
Okay.
I will somewhere. Well, when it's probably about the third round, and fourth round is a pretty heavy model, but third round I'm spraying gloss in one area, flat in another, and to get away from the sudden flat to high gloss, I will respray at the end a very thin mixture of flat and gloss couple drops each
okay.
in a cup of thinner. And when I overspray that, it kind of softens the dividing line, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes the high gloss off the edge, off the most shiny areas. And it kind of softens the dead flat. So it's kind of evens it out. It makes a very good effect. If you do it right, you mix it right, it won't give your dead flat a lighter or a eggshell look. It'll keep it flat.
Okay.
But and it's takes practice.
Right.
Sometimes I don't get what I want. Many times when I start, I have an idea, but it doesn't always go the way I want it, and you just go with it till you get to where you think it's going to work.
Yeah, I've had that where I've done something that somebody's asked me, how'd you do that? That looks fantastic. And I said, if I wanted to duplicate it, I couldn't. Yeah. It just happened.
Again, character to each model.
Yeah,
right? It's the character.
Absolutely. And
well, some of my best effects were accidents.
Yeah.
I had a Union Pacific turbine. I probably shouldn't say this. I don't like people to know I have weather diesels. But I think it was scheduled. Anyway, there was a blister on it that broke. And it left this kind of a hole there. And I'm thinking, now how am I going to hide that? And I decided, well, I'm not going to hide it. I'm going to weather it as if it was intentional. And it had a street running down it. It looked great. People loved it.
See?
But no mistakes, just happy accidents.
Yes, that's about it.
What we are talking about, and that's the good thing about weathering, is we're talking about actually making your models look like real equipment. And real equipment is not perfect. I mean, I remember a buddy of mine looked at my some UP engines that were done by a friend of mine who loves to weather diesels, and he's really good. And he says, those are way too dirty. And I go, no, they're not. He goes, yeah. So we both drove. I put him in my car. We both drove to where Union Pacific runs over here down around the Ontario area. And we waited until a couple of engines, and then I showed him. I go, tell me if they're not. He goes, no, you're right. They're pretty accurate.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great point, because sometimes as modelers, we get inspired by somebody's work, and then we mimic that.
Yeah.
And, well, that's good, and, like, what we're getting here is amazing to see how it's done. There's nothing like seeing the real thing, and then it puts in your head what your goal really should be.
And that's what he said at the very beginning. He said he was used to seeing these. He knows what they looked like actually when they were in operation. I wasn't born then. So thanks a lot. So even though I go to Durango and Silverton and I see them, they take very good care of those. Yet you see how the overall nature has a way of just having their effects on them, because the same thing he accomplishes here, like this number 483, is how we see him in Durango nowadays.
Yeah, when we were in Durango, we seen how quick they get dirty too.
Freshly painted.
Yeah, and it was like
no time.
Wow.
And they already have that effect on there. Yeah, so many different elements come into play. Like you mentioned, nature itself, the train itself. The smoke coming out.
It's a dirty engine. It's a very dirty engine, and the best way I could describe it is, my wife's grandmother, before she passed away, we went to Durango Silverton. We were sitting there right next to the engine, and she was absolutely in awe, because she said, I feel like a little girl again when seeing these steam engines. And then they blew the whistle, and she was wearing a white cashmere sweater, and we started laughing because the whole top of her white cashmere sweater was just full of soot. And she says, I knew I hated these things for a reason.
Grandma got weathered.
Grandma got weathered, and she was very upset because they ruined her sweater. And they are dirty. And so we can imagine this is just in 2 seconds, and these things are constantly running out there, and they get filthy really quickly.
So, Jerry, I just wanted to mention here, so we see you with the brush strokes, again, going in just in one direction there. It's just, it really helps, you don't want to see the strokes themselves, right?
No, you don't want to see the strokes. What I'm doing here is I'm drawing the paint up against the edge.
Right. You see it accumulating there, yeah.
Yeah. And you don't want it to accumulate to the point where it doesn't look right. So that brush is a little bit more stiff, which allows me to get up into the corner. I showed you my little grizzly stiff brushes. Yeah. They have their uses,
I think you should put that in a museum when you're ready to retire it. Sign it.
Well,
there won't be anything left of it, but
he is leaving a streak behind. He is leaving a streak behind because as as it washes back and forth and it tends to rust, constantly happening, it's going to rust and leave streaks in that, which is basically what he's accomplishing. So there are some streaking that's being left behind that, you could call them brush strokes, but it doesn't, you don't want to look like it was applied that way.
Yeah. Okay, so tell us what we got here. We're jumping just a little bit ahead because, of course, we want to work on the logo too. I got a question for you.
Yes.
What about the crosshead guides and some of these working components?
The crosshead guides have always been a problem with me. Do I paint it? If I do, I got to prime and paint it. And if the crosshead has been built with such a certain amount of clearance to move, with the addition of the paint, it's now tight. If it scrapes, it's all to scrape the paint off, and what you've got is a bright silver crosshead. I'm not sure whether it's stainless steel or what the stamp them out of. But I finally came to the idea of blackening the crossheads. I used to use Blacken It, which is no longer available. I got something else.
The crosshead guides.
The crosshead guides, yeah. And when I paint the model, I sometimes will even go back and strip it down to the bare metal that's been blackened. And with a little oil on it, it has a nice oil look, but it's also the original thickness so that the rod or the crosshead does slide fairly easily back and forth. You'll notice that I'm applying some darker colors. One of the things I add to the frame of the locomotive, I've noticed in photographs that a lot of photographs, even the black ones, show the rods look wet, and they are. They've got a lot of oil and grease on them, and they're also quite dark, particularly along the front. And the oil is if you look at it before they use it, it's kind of an amber color, and a mixture of yellow and black will turn green. And if you're not careful, you can turn your rods to green, which is something you don't want to do. But I do mix an oil color and apply it to the crosshead and to the front, and also to some of the joints of the side rods. And again, it's removed, but it gives a grease look to the rods. And when you clear coat, sometimes we'll hit it a little bit with a gloss. But I've got a mixture that I use when I'm done weathering and finished clear coating it. I'll go back and add this. It's a little bit of clear lacquer mixed with black, orange, and maybe a little red in it to give it a brown tinge. It's very transparent, and it's mostly thinner with the gloss, and I'll overspray it, and it doesn't cover it, but it gives it a wet look, and to the point where you feel like if you rub your finger across it, you get oil on your hand, which is the look I'm trying to get. But it gives the mechanism some look, some depth. The front, where the rods are, or the crossheads are, it's darker. Usually by the time you get toward the back of the engine, dirt's been kicked up and becomes lighter. You look at photographs, it's that way. A lot of engines have a blow-off, that's particularly the SP. They have their famous blow-down spreaders, which is near the end of the drivers. And a lot of times the rear driver is a lot whiter, and the rods have it also. So it gives you a chance to using different values to accent the rods. And particularly on a narrow gauge engine like these Ks, the counterweights are on the outside. So you can mix the color, you can deviate from dark to light, and when the engine particularly is running, it shows up. It kind of makes the whole system more visible. And there are some clean engines, like the other one I got is mostly still bare rods, but some of these are so heavy that it's either full of dirt or grease.
You know what you made me appreciate here, Jerry, is that you need to know the locomotive, too. There's a lot that goes into this. This is not just a matter of pushing a little paint here and there.
Well, if you're building a model or even if you're collecting, you should be doing some research on what you've got. And most people will develop a specific interest. And there certainly are enough books out now that you can study. And if you have a favorite locomotive, observe, see what's going on.
Right.
And
you have to also understand the mechanics of anything.
Right.
Basically, if you have an area that's you're adding oil to it, and then on top of that, it's open to the elements of getting dirt and dust. It's gonna, just like your bearings in your car or whatever, they get greasy and ugly and black. So that's kind of what he's done. Is he's basically getting it dirtier and grimier. Yet it's still lubricated, so it's going to have an oily look, which has a greenish tinge to it. For not a full green, but it's a brownish green tinge. And then you have a contrast here because you're going to have areas where it's just dust. For example, on the counterbalance, it's the dirt and the dust that's around it, and you got a nice contrast between the original black paint that was there with the lighter dust earth coming on the counterbalances, and then you have the rods with little where the bearings would be, which are going to be dirt and dark black or that oily look to them.
Right.
I think that's why many of us are drawn to these weathered locos, because even if you don't know, and it's good if you do, all the mechanics in your mind, especially if you ever had the chance to see it, it just looks right. You just look at it, even if you can't pick out why, which is what's nice about this segment, we're starting to know why. It looks right.
And that is the key, because that's one of the things that Jerry focused and helped me focus, because I loved steam engines, but as I watched Jerry and he explained why it would do, he explained about the calcium, he explained about, a lot of the things that were not, the oils, and I'm like, yeah, he's right. How does it dry? And we see it on our own vehicles. For example, our cars, we wash it and it's nice and bright and shiny. However, after a few days, the top of that car is now no longer shiny. It has kind of like an eggshell look because it's the dust accumulating. So it's not bright and shiny. However, the sides, you'll have nice and streaks on your car after a while. So there are some differences.
Yeah.
So our viewers get a plus. Not only do they learn how to weather, we learn a lot about the locomotives too.
And whenever you look at like the locomotives we have here that are completed on the table, and when you see that, this is why your eye feels so good, I think, is because it makes sense on why we have accumulation in more areas than other. Even up here on top with the domes and everything. We appreciate why they're a little more shinier than other aspects down lower on the locomotive.
Absolutely. And weathering is really important, and you could either destroy your model with weathering or you can enhance it. And there is good weathering out there that people do spectacular jobs. Jerry's obviously the one I learned from. And the contrast that I like about Jerry's weathering is the fact that you have shiny black areas, like they look brand new and unscathed, like if somebody came and washed them with a rag. And however, you have other areas that are dirt and on the same engine, so you have a nice contrast of sheens. No different than you would on your vehicles.
And it's kind of fun to weather either a new locomotive or go back in time when they had Russian iron. The locomotives were usually a lot cleaner, but you still have the variations, maybe not as much, but you can highlight certain places. Juan, fortunately, likes early locomotives as well as more modern, and it's been kind of nice. It's much more, in some ways, much more difficult because you got to walk with a soft step because you're dealing with a highly polished locomotive, and you can overdo it real quick. I even go as far as to buff a Russian iron. That's one nice thing about lacquer, to give it a more of a polished metal look. But people will ask me, "You're not going to weather that, are you?" I say, "Yeah, sure." I think weather may not be the right term.
We're going to bring it to life. Is truly the word, and that's really what we're doing. Is we're bringing them to life. I have models that I'm watching them running, and I'm videotaping them, and I'm saying, "Man, all it needs is the effect of the real smoke and the real." And to this date, nobody's really come up with anything that I can honestly say that would overall give me that real effect. Because, I mean, even some of the engines that animate smoke, that's not quite the real thing. It's just, it looks fake. So I prefer not to have it.
You know, you mentioned, Jerry, earlier, too, about at the end of this process that sometimes you'll have to even spray some black back on there.
If you have a black locomotive, that's the easiest. Sometimes when I'm looking at something, I'll think, oh no, I've got what looks like a water spot that I hadn't intended, or a streak that is more pronounced than I wanted it. You can feather in black, and I do it I do it pretty much between each step. Because if I get it early enough, the next step I kind of weather back over it and it blends it. But it works very well. There are some areas on even a heavily weathered boiler where it is not all heavily weathered.
Right.
And but it's the clean ones that take a little more care because you can go further than you want real fast. A good fastener locomotive looks great if it's nice and shiny, but it's still weathered.
Yeah.
I've had customers want me to weather their freight engine, but not their passenger engine.
Oh,
yes. A lot of
I've gone around occasionally with somebody about weathering diesels. They tend to not weather them.
Yeah, and
well, I was going to mention here, just because we're seeing this on the screen. So now we're on to the boiler here.
Yeah.
Right. So this,
which is stage 2. We're in stage 2
still. But this technique here, because we see you with a real thin brush there. So tell us what you're doing.
First of all, you want to get a good quality brush. In this case, it's a pointed brush, and it's not stiff, but it's firm. And if you flex it, it'll snap back.
Yeah.
And it's great for drawing, like I'm doing here, a thin line down the side, and I'll go back and also draw it up to get little streaks, very delicate streaks. You don't want heavy-handed streaks. And a good brush is very necessary. And I get them at an art store. Some hobby shops have some that are usable too. You can see when I'm drawing it, how pointed it is.
Yeah, and the key is what he's doing right now is washing off. He's just sprayed it black
because he sprayed it already. Yes.
Right, and so what he's coming back and he's washing off, like for example, since it comes down from the top, as it rolls up, it comes right back down. Well, there's anything that's kind of in the way is not going to allow it to land there. Yeah. It's going to produce this area that will remain somewhat clean, which is under the handrail stanchions, or under the. So you'll notice that
we see it even in here.
Right, you'll see some separations there that they're not all uniform. As a matter of fact, here's the best one to describe.
Right
there, you'll see that
clean it is.
The brackets and right under the stanchions, they're all standing now. And along the stanchion, you'll see it kind of looks like it just oozes around it, which is...
Again, this is why it makes sense to the eye to look at it, because our brain knows that's what would happen.
Right. Yeah,
and the heavier it becomes, the more that will fill in eventually. But the first time I really became aware of weathering, I was up in Durango, and it was early June. The season was just starting. The engine was still fairly well painted, and it was very clear. I took pictures, and I'm looking at it when I get back, and those streaks are nice. And I've done it from almost the day I started.
Yeah, this would be considered, let's say, middle to heavy. Weathering. It's a little more beat up, not as much sheen. However, it could be dressed up really simple if we wanted to clean it up a little more. But you want some diversity among your engines. You don't want all of them to look the same. And that's what you're doing, is you're obviously not only bringing them to life, but you're giving them their own character.
And I think probably a lot of people are going to be afraid to try this, but for those who are willing, that's actually comforting, right? To know you're not looking for the same result every time, as you both have mentioned. That gives it that individuality.
You definitely, and that's exactly it. You want to individualize your own model to you, and I really encourage anybody to go ahead and try. You have nothing to lose. I mean, painting a model, especially if you're going to start learning how to paint, you're going to paint your model and then start learning how to weather the model too. So, learn the whole process. That way you're going through this and you're you're personalizing them, you know, and that's the key.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and Jerry's paint jobs are, you know, and my paint jobs are very similar. However, I can normally differentiate mine from Jerry's, you know.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah, and we've sometimes run across stuff that he's done in the past from many that he can't remember. And he's asked me, "Did you do this?" And I go, and it might be an earlier paint job of his that now looks like mine because he's way more advanced than I am. And I'll say, "No, I never knew that engine, so I've never done that stuff," you know.
When I started, I did a lot more airbrush work than I do now. And if you go, when you were at Mr. DeWitt's collection last year, one of the railroads he collected were locomotives from the Duluth-Mesabi 9 range. And he has 3 Yellowstones. One is a very early one. And it's one of my earlier techniques, and I shudder every time I look at it. But I said, well, you know, maybe the progression from there to late is a good part of the collection. I can almost tell you when I did it by what it looks like, and gradually I'm changing. But he sold off a lot of my early work.
But Jerry, I think Bob's collection, which many of our viewers got to see, as you mentioned, I think in season 2. But I think that was a nice testament to those who become just so enamored with weathering. Because he had a fabulous collection, but that was his pride and joy, was the weathered models.
Absolutely.
If you have a collection, if you have a collection that's just brass, everything's just brass. If you paint it black, everything's just black. When you weather it, now you're getting individuality between each engine. And if you have a large collection to display, that variation is pleasant to
No, and
see,
I might point out one more thing. I mean, you know, all of us have had in our hands Fuji models or some of the models that are now become collector's item, and we look at them and we know these were hand built and they were absolutely phenomenal models, and now they become, because, you know, they're just rare, you know. The difference is with when you're weathering your job, they're personal, and obviously, you know, as it's a work of art. It's not just when they're weathered correctly, of course, you know, but it is a work of art. And as you can see, this is no different than we refer to him as Rembrandt. It's no different than a Rembrandt.
Among other things.
Yeah, he's been known as Dr. Dirt, Rembrandt. There's a few nicknames for him. However, it is a work of art. Yeah. And anytime I paint, and I do paint, but every time I have a chance, I'll have Jerry paint my model because it is a work of art. It really is a work of art. It's no different than having a work of art hanging on your wall or having it in your display case.
I'm going to go on that smoke box cover.
Absolutely.
You notice my shirt looks a lot like the pad there.
Right.
I'm holding these things in some slightly different positions because of the camera. Which
sure. Well, this is Boyd's camera work, so there's a problem right there.
And many times my head gets between the item and the camera.
We'll just blame it on Boyd. Don't worry about it.
Boyd seems to make it everywhere.
Even when he's not part, though, it's comforting to know he still was a part of this segment.
Oh, absolutely. He had a lot to do with it. Jerry a lot of people have wanted Jerry to do videos throughout the year, but we just couldn't figure out a way how to do it where Jerry could actually sit there and paint and we could video. Boyd actually took the time, and, you know, I think I was laying at a table waiting for them to finish because I knew how long the process was. Yeah. Boyd had absolutely no clue. Yeah,
he's really good. Really appreciate it. Well, Jerry, certainly as we bring it back out to the table here, because we see this process, this was step 2, so you would go through a third series of wash, right?
Yes. And each time I do that, I'm not doing an overall spray. It's that I'm getting closer in hitting certain areas. On this particular model at this time, the next time you see it, you'll find a lot more white washing coming down on the back of the boiler in front of the cab where all the appliances are that are steam driven. I will pick up some of the small detail. A lot of the pipes have leakage that turns white eventually. The sand dome, I usually add color around the lid where the sand has accumulated. everything you're doing is to just bring out the detail that's there. And the more detail, the more you got to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, he's becoming more localized now. We're not necessarily needing the overall wash because we got dirt everywhere we want.
Okay.
Now we're localizing it to specific areas that we know have a greater buildup, and that's where we start to differentiate one area from the other. For example, he's working on the smoke box right now. We're just localizing. We're not spraying the entire model with black. We're just localizing exclusively the smoke box area.
All right.
You can see a little gloss still there. The next clear coat will be a lot flatter.
Yeah.
So as this concludes, though, because we pretty much have this particular process. So after this, you would have gone through and done your flats and everything across there, and then the specific areas that you want to highlight a little bit more if you had to spray a little bit of black into it.
Right. There's some areas that we, for example, depending on what engine, like how he's wanting to do it or I'm trying to do it, sometimes I end up with a model that's a little more weathered than I actually want it in certain areas, and I want to come back and clean it up. I will start coming back with, like on a black model, I will come back and feather in some fresh paint, and then I'll come back with a gloss over that area, and then I'll go over it. In my case, he probably does it maybe a little different. I'll come over with a satin color to kind of blend them all together, but the glossy area will still be a little glossier than the flatter areas. The flatter areas will remain flat. That while the glossy areas I'll tone down the big gloss, but they'll still have a little bit of a sheen to it, more than and it's real simple. The underside flat. You really want the underside. Anything along the front, such as it's going to get constant, pretty flat, but you could also have your cage a little glossy along the top, not necessarily glossy or eggshell or a satin look.
Sure.
So you want to in the cab, the sides of the cab, I like to see a little gloss along the top, and maybe around the bottom I kind of flatten it, or getting down to a satin again. Depending on how dirty I have my cab. Jerry, and how you kind of begin to finalize it.
I will. The next stage, even this stage, the flat becomes more dead flat where I want it. I will cover everything with a flat spray first. Not everything, but the areas I want. I'll come back and hit the areas where I want more of a sheen or a gloss. And I use the clear lacquer, which is glossy, thin. And then I will, as I mentioned before, I will use a very thin mixture of maybe 2 or 3 drops of clear and 2 or 3 drops of flat, and the rest of the cup is thinner, and it puts a very light overspray that softens the high gloss and softens the dead flat. And if there's an area where you've got the two intermingling, it softens that junction, so it doesn't look like you've got a harsh line where one starts and ends, and where the other one starts. In certain areas, like around the firebox, or even on this model where you got ash pans, usually are a lot flatter. They tend to be burnt from use and a lot lighter in color. But the mechanism, usually when I do this next stage, the cylinders usually get a little gloss, but the grease areas get hit, and parts of the two drivers that are underneath the crossheads tend to get a buildup of oil dropping down, so they tend to be a little darker and a little bit wet looking. Whereas the rest of as you go back to the locomotive, whether it's this engine or a regular engine, it will get flatter as you go back. But there's a lot of little things you can do to kind of spark up a model.
Yeah, I know even after this, you continued to work on this piece, even after we were done filming there. It continues to evolve, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's ready now to be reassembled, and I may still go back and add a few things. Once I get the frame and the boiler on, there's always some little places that you can hit locally.
Which is local weathering, which you're basically just adding a little more color to certain things that you're like, I'd like to see a little more of this.
Keep adding a little bit,
Sure.
even until it actually gets out the door and away from me.
Now, Jerry, I got to ask one question that most people are probably afraid to ask. What's it cost?
Well, there's several things to consider. A lot of these models have had work done on them. That has to be figured in. Color, if it's a multiple color, it is different. But roughly speaking, this engine will be somewhere around 1,000, maybe 1,100
For the weathering job.
for the paint.
But again, and how...
for the paint and weathering.
Okay, for the paint and weathering. And how much time? I mean, that's a long... We're seeing it's a long period of time to
It
do
is.
that work.
I usually can't give you an answer as to how long per model, because usually when I'm doing this, there's several involved.
Sure.
And I'm going through each engine at the same stage. And fun time is when I'm doing the last stage. But the last stage, the later the stage, the more fun it becomes, because now you're incorporating your talent or your expertise, if you will, or your knowledge on converting it from a model to what might look like a real engine in a photograph. But roughly it's about that. And I sometimes get models, I try to discourage it nowadays, but that want to be rebuilt. That engine has been considerably rebuilt and detailed. That is pretty much stock. That's a precision. That was very well done. This was, I think it's a Fujiyama. The previous owner basically tore it down and rebuilt it. He had a large layout here in Pasadena, and he built it by himself. He detailed his models. In some cases, he actually scratch-built tenders or whatever. He was very talented.
Yeah.
And Fuji had some problems proportionally. I think he told me he took off the running boards and redid it.
That would explain why I didn't recognize it as
the
a
boiler
Fuji.
jacket has
it's
been
a
replaced.
beautiful
It's
looking
been
logo.
completely rebuilt, and I know that the Fuji's a little longer. It's proportionally incorrect. And when he told me it was a Fuji, I put it right next to the Precision, which is correct proportions. And immediately I said, wow, he did a lot of work. I know what he did. So I'm like, wow, he did a spectacular job. And unfortunately, he lost the ability to see close up, and he's old and can't do things anymore. So he had to retire. But, he was definitely an outstanding modeler.
Yeah.
Well,
So
if you take the time to do that kind of detail work, why not take the time to do that kind of
To get
detail
the
work?
correct
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point. That price may seem high at first, but I would certainly hope, Roland, that our viewers are seeing there's a tremendous value in this type of work.
And when it's done to this level, it can really, really add to the price of a model.
Yeah, and to add to that, the truth is a lot of people assume that, that's a lot of money. And I'm saying to them, you know what? Have you heard of the terminology starving artist? Well, that's basically the same thing.
Right.
Considering the amount of time it really takes to go through this, and a long time ago, I said, I'm going to start doing this. And I started thinking I could make money off of this. Absolutely not.
Labor of love.
By the time I realized the amount of time I was spending, I was not even making, not even 5 cents an hour. It was like, this is way too much. I mean, for the amount of money I was getting paid, people thought, I'm paying all this money for it. You had no clue how many hours of work it basically takes to sit there and get the streaking, get everything right. If I was doing something as simple as airbrushing and maybe finishing in a half an hour, then it
kind of like what Boyd does,
Yeah. Actually, in all defense of Boyd, Boyd does not like airbrush weathering, and he doesn't like weathering. He's had me weather models for him also because he says I want it light, and so I knew what he wanted, so I gave him such a light job that even I said that's too light, but he was happy with it.
Okay.
Well, I enjoyed weathering models for people that know the work involved and appreciate it. Bob DeWitt was that way.
Yeah.
Right.
In fact, we worked close, and it was actually made it interesting.
Like you have several customers that are, they've been waiting, some of them have been waiting over 20 years to get their models painted because the models have been sitting up there.
Yeah.
I think if a new customer comes in, you're going to have them watch this series.
That's what I was going to say. See, now they know, and we certainly appreciate you guys joining us and
well, I think
educating us, really.
What you're doing is great. You know, when I started out, if I needed to know something about soldering or something, you went to your local hobby shop, and if the owner didn't, there were customers there that were more than willing to help you. Now, that's getting more and more difficult, and a program like you've been doing, like the soldering, that takes a little work too, a little expertise, and that knowledge was very helpful.
Absolutely. The contribution you guys have been, thank you very much for the contributions you've been doing to the Model Railroading Society, explaining that, hey, we're not just a bunch of men playing with little toys. There's a lot of talents involved in our hobby. You know, guys who actually do all the designing, guys who do the electronics, guys who do so I mean, it's really been, I've been flabbergasted by some of the jewelers, for lack of a better word, that you've actually had on your show that I was really impressed by. I mean, I would really love to meet them in person.
Well, thank you guys, and we appreciate your willingness, especially you, Jerry and Juan, to share some of this information that has been kind of like a hidden away secret to many for all these years.
Well, as we close out, we again want to extend our appreciation to you for allowing us here, well, in Fred's place, where the coach are. We appreciate that too. But just helping us and our audience to see your expertise, and I'm going to say your artistry.
Yes.
Thank you. So thanks for joining us.